Winston. That's right. All right. It's a Viva on the Street update, and we're covering the Canadian stories tonight. 3 big stories involving Artur Pawlowski and his brother, the contempt proceedings, 2 court rulings coming out of Quebec. But first and foremost, there was a protest on this street earlier today about the pipelines being built out west in Canada, the Wet'suwet'en protests. And I live not far from here. And as I was going to the grocery store, I noticed the protest, and probably more police officers than protesters themselves. But within the protest crowd, I noticed an abnormal amount of what I believe were communist flags, because they were communist flags. So there's a protest for the Wet'suwet'en pipeline blockade protest thing. I think there's actually more police than protesters, but there's a small crowd. I'm just going to the grocery store. But now, the 3 main stories coming out of Canada. Let me just put my hoodie down. Oh, it's winter, by the way, which is why you see this white stuff behind me. Oh, it's so cold. Okay, come back. You're going to warm me up. Artur Pawlowski, the protesting pastor out of Alberta, the Get Out pastor, who, when the Alberta Health Services and police came to his church to tell him that he was, in violation of the Alberta Health Services public health orders of as relates to public congregations, he told them to get out, called them some names as relates to a certain era of the 1939 to 1945 era in the world. He was ultimately, for anybody who followed this story, I covered it, Rebel News covered it thoroughly, he was jailed for a few days for violating the Alberta Health Services measures that were imposed on him by court order. When he kicked out the AHS and the police, and I said at the time, man, they're going to come back, and they're going to come back with a vengeance. And they did, and they came back a second time to attempt to serve him the court order, enjoining him and anyone else aware of the court order not to have unlawful public gatherings. He continued to do it. He was then arrested in dramatic fashion on the side of a highway.
After receiving new enforcement powers for public gatherings Thursday, Calgary police have arrested Artur and David Pawlowski, 2 church leaders notorious for organizing against public health measures.
No one to Nazi style! No one to taser me, kill me!
CPS say they headed to a church before service Saturday morning and warned the organizers ahead of time to follow the rules, which were then still disregarded. The 2 have been charged with organizing an illegal in-person gathering, including encouraging others to join in.
He was found to be ultimately in contempt of court for violating the court order. At one point, he traveled to the United States to do some interviews on television shows, which the Alberta judge did not take kindly to. When he was had his hearing for contempt of court, the judge found him to be in contempt of court, said that, a gentleman would not go to the United States to speak ill of his nation, and sentenced Artur Pawlowski, his brother, and another person to tens of thousands of dollars in fines for the contempt. But the fines and the penalties were not the big issue. In the very contempt order that the Alberta judge rendered against Artur Pawlowski, he ordered Artur Pawlowski, and I'm quoting, paraphrasing, when exercising his rights to freedom of speech, he must also say certain things. And I want to pause this video to read the paragraph of the actual court order, the contempt order against Artur Pawlowski, to show you exactly what the judge ordered Artur Pawlowski to say when exercising his freedom of speech rights. The final term of his probation order will be that when he is exercising his right of free speech and speaking against AHS health orders and AHS health recommendations in a public gathering or public forum, including electronic social media, he must indicate in his communication the following. I am also aware that the views I am expressing to you on this occasion may not be the views held by the majority of medical experts in Alberta. While I may disagree with them, I am obliged obliged to inform you that the majority of medical experts favor social distancing, mask wearing, and avoiding large crowds to reduce the spread of COVID-19. Most medical experts also support participation in a vaccination program unless for a valid religious or medical reason you cannot be vaccinated. Vaccinations have been shown statistically to save lives and to reduce the severity of COVID-19 symptoms. So some people after watching that might say that when the judge says when you are exercising your freedom of speech rights, you must say the following, that in Canada we do not have any remaining freedom of speech rights, and you couldn't be blamed for having such a feeling. But thankfully, because Artur Pawlowski is a fighter and more of a fighter than many other Canadians, he fought that court order. He appealed that court order, the contempt court order, and that court order was suspended pending a full hearing on the court order itself. So he went to the Alberta Court of Appeal. The Alberta Court of Appeal basically suspended the contempt proceedings against him, or the contempt court order, until a full hearing on the merits, which is, at the very least, something of a small victory for freedom of speech, for sensible, logical law and order and constitutional rights in Canada. Now, Rebel News, Ezra Levant, Sheila Gunn Reid, David Menzies have been covering this story left, right, and center, and they are basically the only ones covering it, because if you go Google this, it's virtually a media blackout to an inexplicable sense. You will not find any other media agency reporting on this, and it doesn't make any sense, except it makes total sense, because you can't have the media reporting on something that might embarrass the judiciary of Canada. So a small victory coming out of Artur Pawlowski, if only temporary. We will see if it's a victory on the merits. And by all things that are holy, it should be, because that court order enjoining Artur Pawlowski, or any other Canadian for that matter, to say certain things when they are exercising their rights to freedom of speech. If you are compelled to say certain things while exercising your rights to freedom of speech, you do not have rights to freedom of speech. Now, on the issue of constitutional rights, two other court orders coming out of Quebec, which are not good. They're actually fundamentally bad. A little while back, the Premier of Quebec said that he was basically going to lay off healthcare employees who would not get fully vaccinated in the province of Quebec. He set an original deadline, which was passed, and then set a secondary deadline, and then ultimately abandoned the second deadline to fire healthcare workers who were not vaccinated. Because when you're in the midst of the most devastating pandemic the world has ever seen, the first thing you do, logically and obviously, is fire healthcare workers, even if they're unvaccinated. And there were issues as to whether or not they were unvaccinated because they had already been infected and therefore had natural immunity. Regardless, we have a Premier of Quebec, a leader, a political leader, who says this pandemic is so serious, we need to fire healthcare workers if they choose not to get vaccinated. And we're only dealing with a very small percentage of healthcare workers. Anyhow, they suspended the deadline, not once but twice. But regardless, there was a pending court proceeding, an injunction to enjoin the government from enforcing this vaccination policy. And even after the government abandoned the deadline for political or whatever purposes, the court comes in and says, yeah, we would not suspend that policy because we're a court. We are not in the business of making policy decisions or policy determinations on injunctive bases for the government. That's a government issue, and it's not our position to take positions or usurp the powers of the government, and we would have allowed that government measure because it's not our business to make policy decisions for the government on injunctive bases. So after the government comes in and says we're going to suspend this deadline to compel vaccination of healthcare workers, because that's how serious things are here in Quebec, that we have the luxury of firing healthcare workers. After the government says we're suspending that deadline, the courts come in and say, yeah, well, we would not have invalidated that policy in the first place. So make of that what you will. And then the third case, which is equally as depressing, is a group of citizens filed to enjoin the courts to declare unconstitutional the vaccine passports in the province of Quebec, the requirement that you show proof of full vaccination in order to get access to restaurants, gyms, yada, yada, yada. A group of citizens filed a complaint saying this is unconstitutional, it violates our fundamental rights and liberties, and the court came back on the injunctive basis and said, no, You have not proven anything more than a mild inconvenience. You have not proven constitutional violations and serious and irreparable harm, which is what is required on an injunctive basis. You have just shown something of an inconvenience. Oh, you can't go into restaurants or cafes or gyms or libraries or whatever. Not serious enough to warrant injunctive relief. So that is the update of the Canadian COVID situation. By and large depressing, with some mild glimmers of hope coming out of the west of Canada. The west of Canada is looking a lot like the west of the United States, the last bastion of freedom, the last bastion of the semblance of freedom. But that's it. Based on the way Winston is shivering in my arms, I think I should probably head back. That is where we're at. I hope you like this. If you do like this, be sure to like, share, subscribe, hit the notification bell, yada, yada, yada. You know what to do. If you want to follow Robert Barnes and me on Locals and support us there, support us, get lots of exclusive content at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. And above all else, don't lose faith. Keep fighting the good fight. Over time, truth prevails and truth will prevail. With that said, peace out, peeps. Peace out. Booyah.